Hey, good afternoon to everyone who's joined us. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ann Kim. I'm a senior fellow at Future Ed, and I'm also a contributing editor at Washington Monthly Magazine. So today's topic is college remedial education. It was an issue that was very much in the spotlight about 15 years ago and very much deserves to be in the spotlight again. In June, Future Ed released a report on the status of developmental education in American colleges, or more specifically, developmental education reform. So one of the most interesting nuggets that I learned while researching this report was the history of remedial education in America. So according to Hunter Boylan of Appalachian State University, the nation's first remedial classes were offered at the nation's first college, which of course was Harvard. So at the time, every textbook was produced in Latin, which meant that they were pretty much inaccessible to your average early American colonist. So what Harvard did was they hired Latin tutors to get their students up to speed. And that was the original purpose of developmental education, to make higher education more accessible to people who weren't ready for it. But as you'll hear today, over the years, developmental education became more of a barrier than a gateway, particularly for low-income and minority students, many of whom spent multiple semesters slogging through remedial ed and oftentimes not making it through. So the purpose of today's discussion is to talk about how to make developmental education, how to help developmental education regain that original purpose, to broaden access to higher education and to promote social mobility. So this afternoon, you're going to be hearing from some of the nation's leading experts on DevEd, and we'll be hearing about the potential that could be unlocked if the innovations that arose from the original DevEd movement are replicated nationwide in the future. But before we turn to our esteemed panel, I want to turn things over to my co-host, Michael Iskowitz. Michael is the founder and president of the HEA Group, and he's going to give us a big picture take on what is at stake. Michael?
Thank you so much, Anne. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Michael Itzkowitz, founder and president of the HEA Group, and I've been working on higher education issues for quite a while now. A few lifetimes ago, I worked at the U.S. Department of Education, where I directed the College Scorecard Project. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the scorecard was the largest release of federal higher education data in the history of the government. And as of today, it contains information on over 5,000 institutions and includes 2,000 data points on each and every one of them. This initiative aimed to provide critical information to prospective students looking to reap the benefits of a post-secondary credential. And there are many, as higher education remains one of the surest paths to economic mobility. In short, we aim to answer a few high-level questions: whether students were likely to complete, whether their studies led to decent paying jobs after they did, and if they were able to pay down their loans after they attended an institution. Now, as you're probably aware, it's going to be increasingly difficult for students to end up with a decent paying job if they never complete step one, earning their degree. And it may be even more difficult for these students to manage their loan payments, as non-completers are 3 times more likely to enter default. To sum it up, college completion is a critical benchmark on a student's path to realize financial health and economic stability. Everyone who steps foot on a college campus, regardless of their background or income status, deserves this opportunity. And quite recently, we've seen some colleges truly delivering on this promise, as they regularly enroll students from low and moderate income backgrounds and provide them with the necessary skills to succeed in today's economy, leaving them better off than the previous generation. It's truly amazing to see. And while there are numerous success stories that we could and should celebrate, there are also areas of concern and opportunities for improvement. One of the things that fits that description: too often, students enter an institution, begin a program of study, but leave with absolutely nothing in hand. At four-year institutions, completion rates hover around 60%. That's not enough. And for those entering two-year institutions, the odds of winning a coin flip are often greater than earning a credential. That's why today's webinar is so important and why I'm proud to co-host this event with my friends at Future Ed. Providing students an opportunity to improve their life outcomes through higher education is a lifelong passion of mine, and it's something that set the direction for the creation of my organization, the HEA Group. In general, we are fascinated by the outcomes that colleges produce for their students, ensuring that each institution and college pathway provides value for all who enroll. This is not only critical for those who enter college, but it's also imperative for the United States if we wish to remain globally competitive by filling the necessary jobs of today by preparing the citizens of tomorrow. This event will drill down on one of the most important things we need to stay focused on, ensuring all who enter college make it all the way through. And few things are more crucial towards that goal than the success of a student's first few semesters in school. However, as Anne and Future Ed have rightfully pointed out in their new report, students aren't always prepared to succeed when they receive their high school diploma and submit their application. And for those students who may need a little bit of extra help to catch up, they rarely do. The pandemic also presented us with unprecedented challenges, forcing students to learn from home, teachers to instruct from afar, and a bunch of operational obstacles none of us could have ever anticipated. It's really taken a toll on student learning. Just recently, we saw a report that ACT scores hit a record low in 2023. Only 21% of high school students who took the test demonstrated college readiness in math, science, reading, and English. And even worse, more than 4 out of 10 students showed no proficiency whatsoever. However, just because these students didn't meet these benchmarks doesn't mean that they don't wish to pursue and don't deserve the opportunity to obtain a post-secondary credential. In fact, if we want to remain globally competitive, the fact is we need more students in higher education today than ever before. A recent report from Georgetown's Center for Education and Workforce recently highlighted that over 70% of open jobs within the next decade will require some sort of post-secondary education. The truth is, there's just no way around it. Yet, as of now, when students haven't displayed proficiency in certain subject areas, they're often placed in remedial education courses to get them up to speed before they begin their degree officially. Now, that seems reasonable, right? Well, sure. And that's exactly what Complete College America aimed to investigate in a report a while back. While I'm sure we all hope to see the positive effect of these courses we're having on student achievement, we saw something different, and it was deeply troubling. For those who entered community college, nearly 4 in 10 students who took a remedial education course never completed that class. And as you probably could have guessed, even fewer students, less than 1 out of every 10, ended up leaving with a degree in hand. The results on underrepresented populations, even worse. Ultimately, the old model and way of thinking didn't just fix our problem. However, this research did spur advocacy efforts beginning in the early 2010s. And while there have been notable strides over the past decade, unfortunately, many of those efforts have now stalled. As co-host, my job here today is very easy, as pointing out the shortcomings doesn't take all that much effort. The tougher job of identifying opportunities for improvement and implementing an advocacy agenda to move the needle on student outcomes is where the real work lies ahead. Fortunately for all of us, there are real people here today that are actually continuing to do this work. As you will soon hear from our expert panel, we cannot let these efforts stay stagnant. The risks to students, taxpayers, and our nation are just way too high. And while there may be no silver bullet, we now have more information and expertise in what works to improve all outcomes for these students. That being said, you all are in for a treat today. So as I mentioned, we are honored to be part of this important event. This is a timely and critical topic that can have a huge impact on students, the return they get on their post-secondary education endeavors, and the economy that needs students adequately trained to fill the jobs of tomorrow. So with that, I turn it over to Anne to introduce the impressive panel who will be joining us here today. Anne?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. So I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists and then jump right into the discussion. Full bios for everyone are on their website. We'll also be taking questions from the audience, so please submit questions in the Q&A box that you see on your screen, and we will be answering them at the end of the webinar. So joining us today are Tristan Denley. He is the Deputy Commissioner for Academic Affairs and Innovation for the Louisiana Board of Regents. Amy Getz, who is a senior program associate at West Ed, Melinda Karp, who is the founder and principal of Phase 2 Advisory, and Brandon Protis, who is assistant vice president for Alliance Engagement at Complete College America. So Brandon, I actually want to start with you. Complete College America was one of the organizations at the forefront of DevEd reform. And if you could help set the context for those in the audience who may not have been on the scene 15 years ago and are unfamiliar with this issue, and just kind of give us a very brief history of the impetus for reform and then its early impacts.
Absolutely, and thank you, Anne, and for being able to participate on this panel. You started us off already talking about how developmental education should be a gateway, but we've seen that it's actually a barrier for students to succeed. And Michael talked about as well, particularly for Bill POC students when we look at it from an equity perspective. So in 2012, Complete College America released a report called Remediation, Higher Education's Bridge to Nowhere. And it really had 4 main points. Too many students start in remediation. Remediation doesn't work. Too few students complete college gateway courses, and too few students graduate. We still see those issues today. In fact, since that report, CCA has released 3 other publications, Expanding the Divide, and then more recently, No Room for Doubt and Co-Requisite Works, that has shown the increasing data that shows there are better ways of doing it. I will often say, by the way, traditional prerequisite remediation instead of developmental education. Hunter Boylan, who you cited in the beginning, he talks about developmental education as a combination of adult andragogy and developmental psychology, which is something we want to see. The problem is in the traditional prerequisite remediation courses where students think that they're signing up for a college course, and they're put in pre-college courses, 1, 2, 3. We've talked to systems and colleges that have 4, 5, or 6. So think about the psychological barriers as well as other barriers of time and money before a student can ever take that college level course. So when we released Bridge to Nowhere in 2012, this was a clarion call. And it was met with opposition because it was this monumental paradigm shift that we were calling for in developmental education. It challenged decades of practice of how we've always done things, as well as there is a logic for if a student doesn't have certain knowledge is shown in a placement test, maybe we need to fill in those gaps. There's so much to unpack there in terms of the deficit-based approach as opposed to an asset-based approach of what students come with. And what we've learned since that time, and CCA has been steadfast, is just a few things. One is we need to move to scale. So not just benefiting students on the edges, and that's done through a policy approach through the grass tops as well as practice on the grassroots level. It is absolutely a structural and systems-based change when we move to scale developmental education reform, but it also needs the pedagogical changes for what's happening in the classroom. And finally, I think it's 3 things that fit together. There's placement that goes hand in hand with math pathways. And one of the things that we've called for strongest is co-requisite support as an end to all prerequisite traditional remediation.
Terrific. Tristan, I want to turn to you. You were one of these people on the ground who were implementing this paradigm shift that Brandon just mentioned. And you've actually led DevEd reform in 3 states so far, Tennessee, Georgia, and now Louisiana. And in fact, one other reformer I spoke to called you the Johnny Appleseed of DevEd reform. So can you tell us a little bit more about what DevEd reform looks like in practice in the states where you've worked and the highlights of some of the impacts that you've seen? I think there's some new numbers from Louisiana, for instance.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to do that. So yes, I mean, it doesn't seem like 15 years ago, but it really has been going on now for at least 15 years. So I was lucky enough to be provost back at Austin Peay State University so this was one of the institutions where this co-requisite approach was first created. So it actually grew out of faculty work. This was a faculty-led initiative on Austin Peay's campus. The math department and the English department there recognizing to really serve the students that they had on that institution, they needed to find a better way to be able to enable those students to be able to find success in early math and early English courses. And they saw tremendous improvements that they, just as we've already heard, typically speaking on that campus, about 1 in 10 of the students who started in standalone developmental education ever actually went on to pass a credit-bearing math class. And that just that just doesn't make any sense at all, right? When you're losing 90% of your students along the way, that's just crazy. And so they developed this idea of enabling those students right from the very start to be enrolled in the credit-bearing math classes and English classes that they needed for their degree program, but accompanying that with support along the way, what's now called a co-requisite support experience. But in those days, we had other nomenclature in those days. When I left Austin P and then moved to the system office of the Tennessee Board of Regents, there was a lot of interest in taking those ideas from Austin P and seeing whether they actually could work at scale across all of the state universities and colleges in Tennessee. And I was lucky enough to be part of that work. And in many ways, that work was really grew out of looking at the data. We were able to use the statewide data structure to be able to look at across campuses to see that the lessons that we could learn there at Austin P were not unique to that institution, despite the fact that so often campuses really do think of themselves as unicorns. There was so much that other institutions could really learn from what had happened at that sister institution. And so we were able to use the data to disaggregate in that state. We used the ACT score to see that actually at every ACT placement level, students who were educated using the co-requisite approach did much better, twice, 3 times, 4 times better than their colleagues who went through a standalone remediation experience. And so, yeah, we were able to scale co-requisite there across the state universities and colleges in Tennessee using that approach, enabling faculty to see the data and then enabling faculty to be able to implement those reforms at scale. And moved on to Georgia, where we really employed a similar kind of approach, again, looking at the state's data, but there we were able to really dig inside to see, are there in fact structural strategies that we could get perhaps even a little further to understand. So does it matter whether we have the same instructor in the 2 experiences, or does it matter if they're different? Does it matter if the students are all kind of mixed together in the credit-bearing class or separated? And so, because the reality is that these structural changes are only part of the picture, we also had to understand, well, what are the pedagogical changes? What are the changes that actually need to happen in the classroom that enable faculty to really get the full benefits of all the work they're doing? I think Brandon shared it really well, and I've spoken many times with on panels with Hunter, and I think the reality is, we know this, that the aims of developmental education were to provide a support structure, a way in which we could engage students to really live up to their full educational potential. But that structure where these supports were happening before the credit-bearing class meant that basically all of that work was being sort of just dissipated by the structure itself. And so when we recognize that and we're able to reposition that, then all of that work really does actually live up to its full potential. And we see that in the results of students. There in Tennessee, the results moved from like 15% up to 55%. In Georgia, the success rates in math began in the 20s and ended up in the early 60s. And now, as you said, I've just been involved in working with faculty here in Louisiana. All of Louisiana's universities and community colleges across the state, all 28, have now fully implemented co-requisite mathematics. And again, we've seen a 5-fold increase in the success rate in math already. And this fall, we're implementing English at scale as well. So it's just very exciting to see thousands and thousands of students' lives completely transformed by this, I think, incredibly important approach to mathematics and English education across universities and colleges.
Terrific, thank you. Amy, Tristan talked about this co-requisite model, which is one of the major paradigm shifts that took place in DevEd reform. I'd like to ask you about another paradigm shift, and that's in changes to content, especially math. You were one of the pioneers of what's known as math pathways. So can you talk a little bit about that particular reform, what that is and its impact, and including outside the sphere of DevEd? It has spillover effects, from what I understand.
Yes, so the concept of math pathways is that students should be taking a gateway mathematics course that is aligned to their programs of study and to their goals. And by gateway, we mean that it's the first course they take that has credit that actually can be applied towards a degree, or another way to put it is that it earns general education credit, at least. So traditionally, that was college algebra for almost all students. And people began to question that again about 2 decades ago. And as we started to look at the issues around developmental education reform, we also saw there were issues in this lack of relevance to students' lives and goals in what they were learning and the content they were learning. So 2 other pathways emerged as kind of the core of math pathways. So there's the traditional pathway of that we call now pathway to calculus that often begins with college algebra or pre-calculus. It's a quantitative reasoning pathway. There's statistics. Some places have some different pathways, different interpretations of that, but that's sort of the core of the idea. So when we talk about these increases we are seeing in success in mathematics, in most cases, that is the combined effect of the acceleration and use of co-requisites, getting students directly into gateway mathematics courses, and the getting students into the right gateway math course. And I think we can all think about when something is relevant, you tend to do better with it. So this has really been hand in hand in mathematics as part of the DevEd reform movement. As you said, it also impacts students who are coming in at the point where they do not need co-requisite supports because they have the opportunity to get directly into a math course that really is more relevant to them and in which they are more likely to succeed. I want to address a common misperception about math pathways, and that is that the purpose or the reason it works is that it's just getting students into easier courses. And like those students couldn't do college algebra. That is absolutely not true. Any student can pass college algebra, but there's no reason they should. So this really is about relevance. And the real point is that every gateway math course should be rigorous. And I think of rigor as it should prepare a student for success in whatever the next step in their education and career and life is. So for college algebra, that may be preparing them for calculus. And there's actually some question about whether it does that. In statistics, that may be they should be prepared to be able to use statistics as a social scientist or in biotech fields or things like that. For quantitative reasoning, should be that they are ready to take on the kind of complex decision making we have in this world around finances, around understanding statistics, making decisions. Think about all the data we were inundated with during the pandemic and trying to make sense of that. And then we have one issue I also wanted to bring up that I see as a problem in the way math pathways have been implemented is that some places get around this issue of getting not having DevEd, and they're still requiring intermediate algebra. And they get around that by saying it's a college course, but it doesn't earn that college credit that counts for Gen Ed. That means it's really developmental education. And so, for example, Florida, which is considered a leader in DevEd reform, actually still has most of its students going through intermediate algebra. And I think it's an important thing that we need to address as sort of one of our next steps in math pathways and all of this work.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Amy. Finally, Melinda, I want to pick up on this point of the spillover impacts of DevEd reform. And one of the downstream effects of DevEd reform has been to spark these new conversations outside of the field. We're talking about whole college transformation and new thinking about what student success and college completion look like. And this is something that you've worked on a lot on the ground with a lot of institutions. So if you could start us off with a little bit about what these broader conversations have looked like.
Yeah, of course. And I'll say that, we see wide variation in some institutions. DevEd reform has really been about changing math and English. and it's the coalition of the willing, and it's not whole institution reform. But I think it's a fantastic proof point of when institutions take a broader view, DevEd reform really has spurred these broader conversations. As you alluded to, and I think we've heard snippets of from all the other panelists, it is an opportunity to think about what could we do differently. And given that we now have such substantial evidence that these reforms work at scale, it's also an opportunity to say, oh, we can do things differently and see impact if we work at it, right? So it's a lot harder to be a naysayer than it was 15, 20 years ago when folks like Tristan and folks who were thinking about multiple measures assessment they were thought of as renegades, right? Like they were out of their mind. Like, what do you mean we're going to put students who can't pass the accuplacer, which, spoiler alert, isn't such a great test, but they can't pass the accuplacer and we're going to put them in college level courses? Like, you're nuts. And now we know that that's not nuts. And so it has begged the question of, well, then what else can we do differently? So at forward thinking institutions, we start to think about, well, what else outside of math and English might need to change? How do we use this work to think about shifting pedagogy in anatomy and physiology and psychology, right? Because getting through Gateway is critical. It is not enough to get students to completion, which is the goal or transfer. And so we're starting to see institutions think about, okay, well, if now students who used to not be in intro-level history or intro-level sciences because they were still in developmental coursework are suddenly in those classes, what does that do for the biology faculty? How do we talk about supporting pedagogy throughout the institution, right? And so these conversations have been broadened and nurtured because of the DevEd work. I will say that the evidence so far is that we are getting many more students through Gateway. Completion has been harder. And so that has demanded that we think about what else has to happen, right? And so if you think of this as incremental, radical yet incremental change, that's what this movement really has done. The other thing I think has increasingly come to the forefront, and this is partly a pandemic thing too, is forcing a conversation about what readiness really means. So, and I think Brandon, you might have alluded to this, is readiness, can you do math, or are you struggling with your metacognitive skills? Right? Like, let's tear that apart and think about why are students perhaps not quote unquote ready for a certain class. Let's talk about what are those skills undergirding college success and help students get what they need when they need it. It may not be that they need additional math support. They may need access to stable internet, right? Let's disentangle what it is that's causing students to get tripped up. And so forward-thinking institutions are using their DevEd reform to think about this broader notion of transformation. And my people who know me know that that's my bias, is that we need to transform our institutions, no small feat, because any one little piece of the puzzle is going to be insufficient when we look at the trajectory of an entire student's life. The final thing I just want to say is that I think this is about continuous improvement. We tend in higher ed to want the silver bullet and to have the magical unicorn come in and save us. And I think DevEd has been a really strong indicator that we can make these radical yet incremental changes in ways that are really, really meaningful, but we're not done, right? So co-rec works, and there are some students for whom it may not be the best approach, right? So what are we going to do about those students? What are we going to do about students in adult basic education and who are English language acquisition learners who historically have not been part of this effort? Where do they fit in, right? So it's about continuous improvement. We fixed one piece of the puzzle, and now we've got to figure out what the next thing is. And so I tend to take a much more forward-looking approach, just because that's kind of where our research has been lately. But I want to say that acknowledging the immense strides that have been made over the past 15 years in this work, and think about, well, then what comes next, right? Because we're never done.
Terrific. Thank you, Melinda. So I'm going to open things up to the panel and also open things up to the audience. So please don't forget to put your questions into the Q&A box that you'll see on your screens, and we will get to your questions in the course of this discussion. So the first question that I have for the panel is the challenge of scale. Reform has not been universal. In fact, it's been very lumpy, it's been sporadic, it's not distributed as evenly as it could across the country. And a lot of benefits, students are not getting the benefits of the reforms that we've discussed so far. So could everyone kind of give their take on where are we on the status of reform? And how far do we have to go? How do we get to a place where every student who deserves this kind of help gets it? Who wants to start?
Sure, I'll jump in. Why not? So I really wanted to echo what Melinda has just said, because I think the reality is that, yeah, I think there is now every evidence that co-requisite reform really does work. It works at scale. It works all across the student body. It works at the scale of the population of a state. And it works not at the margins, but very significant improvements. And I think that in and of itself is an extraordinarily strong statement, which we didn't have 5-10 years ago, but we do today. And so if people go away from nothing else from today, I think it is really, I want them to go away knowing that the evidence that co-requisite is a proven strategy is just unassailable. Now, that said, there is still a lot of work to be done, because the reality is it is, I think, a necessary but not sufficient step in moving the needle on college completion. And so I think, basically everybody on this panel could just as easily be talking this afternoon about all kinds of other strategies that we also have been involved. I mean, I don't know how many projects I've worked on with Amy around math pathways, or around guided pathways, or around the improvements in advising or engagement, there's so many of these strategies, but just as we know very persuasively about the power and effect of co-requisite, we also know those other strategies well. And so I do think actually that one of the powerful barriers around doing this work is, on the one hand, that change is very challenging. Change at scale is even more challenging. And change at scale across multiple strategies is even more challenging. And I think that in many ways, I think that is the sort of the place where we sit across the country, that there are, just as you've described, sort of a lumpiness to the way in which that change has happened. And I think part of that is because there are places in the country where a momentum has been behind this work, and they have engaged that work, and lots has happened all together. And then there are other places in the country where even the mildest change has been extraordinarily challenging. And so they weren't even able to get to stage one to be able to show the benefits of the efforts that they were trying to engage. So I'm curious what others have to say, but I mean, I'm still tremendously optimistic about the fact, especially now that we have so much evidence, that places where perhaps 5-10 years ago this work was just very difficult to do, maybe today is a time when this could be revisited. But I think that's the place where we are, where there are places in the country, and some are states that I've worked in, but there are certainly others too, where tremendous amounts of work has been done and tremendous benefits have been seen in not only success in basic English and math, but also across full completion statistics, moving graduation rates by 20-30%. But there are also places where to do that work is going to be really challenging, because change at scale is so challenging.
There's a question from the audience here that gets to one of these challenges, perhaps. And the question from the audience is, how do we get buy-in from faculty who see developmental courses as a gatekeeper rather than a gateway? So
yeah, I can take that. And Tristan was correct when he said this is really about the change process and how do we do that. So I remember on my campus, when we moved to co-requisite, literally saying to people, what do you mean a student who can't do fractions on the AccuPlacer is going to be put into college algebra? Simple statement, so much to unpack there. How do we know college algebra? How do we, is the right math course, as Amy was talking about, or the appropriate course? How do we know that they actually can't do fractions by taking a test one place in one point of time that often looks at procedural knowledge, not conceptual knowledge? When high school GPA is a better predictor, how do we see the potential of that student versus what they could be able to do as support, as opposed to where they start in the back? The issue also is, I was looking at a single student. And we often hear with faculty, well, what about the student who ... who doesn't even know their basic numeracy? We need to look at the data and the collective data to make what's invisible visible. So that's not pass rate, because the students who make it through traditional prerequisite remediation, they're survivors. And if that's who you see in your class, those 1 out of 10 who make it through, they are going to do well. And so that data might say this is working, but it's false data. Throughput looks at those who start in traditional prerequisite remediation, how many get to and through, and you're making visible the 9 out of 10 students who never make it. So it's really important that we use the data to be able to drive the change, and not just national data, but the data from your own institution. So we get beyond just the anecdotal stories or about the what if cases, and really look at it from a systemic point of view and think of it from a change process. And we need to involve faculty to drive that effort once it's there. Policy absolutely needs to be there to scale it. Otherwise, it's the coalition of the willing. But once together, hand in hand with policy, faculty need to be driving that change. Given what we know works, that it would be harmful to hurt students where 9 out of 10 are not getting through. That is an educational malpractice and injustice. Given that, how do we work together to make this work? And that's really about focusing on the change process.
Amy, I think you had some thoughts on this question as well.
I really appreciate Brandon saying that faculty should drive this. I taught dev ed math, so you'll never find a more caring, committed group of faculty than dev ed educators. And it's so important to treat them respectfully and to acknowledge that none of them are in this game to hurt students. And that doesn't mean they may not have some deficit-based views. They may, but you need to respectfully help them recognize that and understand it. And I love what Brendan said about bringing it back to data and systemic issues, that this is not about blaming the faculty who are teaching those courses. It is about the fact that those faculty have been put in a position by the system in which their best work is not enough to help those students. And so I really think when we talk about asset-based approaches to students, we also need to think about asset-based approaches to faculty.
And I'll chime in and double down a little bit on what Amy and Brandon just said around the professional learning for faculty. What we are asking faculty to do in many instances is actually do their jobs differently. And often they're doing their jobs the way they are because of structural issues, not because they're bad actors or anything like that. But we want them to do their jobs differently when they're working with different students. And so sometimes the resistance is from fear. It's from not knowing, right? And so when we say to someone, do your job differently and don't provide support, of course you're going to hear resistance, right? Because why would anyone want to set themselves up for failure, which is what in some ways we're asking faculty to do. And so I do think one of the other pieces of this is, in addition to using the data, to really be thoughtful about professional learning opportunities. And again, to frame them not just as like, go to this conference, although those are delightful, but how can we embed learning and pedagogy and conversations about who our students are and what do we do with these data into the daily practice of faculty, which is not a luxury many of them have, but that is their practice and their calling. I think often we ask folks to change without supporting the change. And then it sounds like this resistance. But actually, it's a pretty rational reaction, if you ask me. So I would just add to the call for using data and taking an asset-based approach to really structuring some thoughtful professional learning. And that learning should look different depending on what phase of the reform you're in, because people need different things at different moments, right? But really thinking about how you can support faculty rather than assume they're coming, as Amy alluded to, from a place of negativity or deficit.
I do want to build on that a little bit too, because I think it's just incredibly important. And that's across the 3 states that I've been involved in scaling co-requisite, it's been extraordinarily important to engage faculty at every level. What we tried to do at each time was to create a policy structure that empowered faculty members to actually be able to put in place this new approach and to engage them as professionals on their campuses, knowing their students and knowing their institution, to be able to implement co-requisite in the way that made the most sense within their campus context. I think that there's every temptation in the world from a policy perspective to create a policy that's sort of so tight that then you don't give faculty members the ability to be able to be the educational professionals that they are. So instead, yeah, let the policymakers be able to create a framework that empower faculty members to do the work that they need to do in the classroom. And that, from my perspective, has been the secret of the work across Tennessee, Georgia, and in Louisiana too, to enable faculty members, as we say, to get the professional development that they need to be able to inform themselves about how to implement this kind of pedagogy, and then get out the way.
Right. There's some great questions coming in, and encourage everyone to keep them coming, please. I do want to ask one question though first, about equity and what's at stake if reform stalls and we're at the status quo forever. And Amy, I know that you and Bruce Vandal have done some research on what's achievable if reform were nationwide, but how do each of you see what's at stake if reform does not move forward in its various iterations, particularly on this question about equitable outcomes for the students who most need the help to get through college?
So I think what is at stake? So much. I like to use an example, a very specific student story that this was published by the California Acceleration Project back before they had the policy shift in California that really created opportunity at scale. And it was about a student who he didn't take 4 years of math in high school because he didn't think he'd ever get to go to college. And then his aspirations changed and he went to college and he was placed into a dev ed math course. And it was just so frustrating for him. He dropped out of that course, but he excelled in all of his other courses. He was, made the dean's list. It was at a community college. He was being recruited by universities to come, and he hadn't done his math credit yet. And so he heard about another college that he could get to where he could do a co-rec stats course. He went, he got an A, he actually kind of fell in love with statistics. He felt very empowered by it, and he ended up, going on to one of the University of California colleges or universities. I can't remember which one, but that's all accidental. He happened to hear about this other college that had this other opportunity. He happened to have whatever resources it took to get to that college. That is a failure of the system because that's an accident that he succeeded. Now, of course, for him, it's not an accident because he persisted. But from a system point of view, that's an accident. And success should not be an accident. We should have structures that create the pathways that we know are most likely to put students on the pathway to success.
Perfect. So a couple of questions from the audience here. Future Ed's audience has a lot of folks who are involved in the K-12 space. So we're getting a couple of questions here from the audience about what lessons there can be for secondary schools from this conversation. And also if anyone has seen an effective co-requisite model at the high school level, perhaps in dual enrollment or an early college type class. Does anyone want to weigh in on that one?
One thing I'll say, and I'll let others take the co-rec and dual and concurrent enrollment, but I do think the landscape is changing of what dev ed and particularly placement is around the country. So the first thing I will say is that if you are at a high school, you need to figure out what the landscape is in your area, because you can't assume that all of your students are going to just be taking the AccuPlacer or using a high school graduation test, or it may vary, Amy just alluded to this, from college to college. And so we do our K-12 students a disservice if we don't help them understand what will be expected of them when they take the next step. And unfortunately, I do think given the innovation in the space, it's a little messy right now if you are a high school person. I say that as a mom of a high school senior too, so I have great empathy. The other thing I'll say is this part around what does college readiness mean, I think is really important, right? And this is actually a throwback. We talked about this 15, 20 years ago also about college readiness is about the courses you take, but it's also about the metacognitive skills that you have. It's about the study skills that you have. It's about understanding that when a college instructor says you have to work hard, that actually looks different than when a high school teacher says it. Like working hard in college, those hidden norms are different. And so as higher ed starts to unpack that you can be ready in one dimension and not another, and start to kind of bake that into their placement and dev ed processes, I think it's worth K-12 thinking about that as well, right? So it's not just our students taking the right courses, but how are you conveying what a syllabus is? How are you helping students understand how to navigate the difference between going to visit a teacher in high school versus going to office hours in college? These are not new conversations, but I think they've become magnified as the landscape of dev ed has shifted. And so that, you know, I would just put out to folks in K-12 that that's worth being cognizant of, because the landscape is shifting. And I suspect will shift for quite a few more years, particularly as we come out of, if that's what we call it, come out of COVID. But just being mindful of this would be helpful.
Let me just pick that thread up before we go to the dual enrollment thing, because I think it's just really important. I think a lot has been made over the years about, so very significant increases in student success in college math and English through co-requisite, but there are still students who are unsuccessful in co-requisite, just as there are students who are unsuccessful in every college course. I mean, the reality is that's not unique to co-requisite, but it's still. So what do we know about those students who are unsuccessful? So some of what we know is those students came in with significant preparation challenges to begin with. But we know that, so it may well be that the success rates of those students is, 30, 40%. We know historically is the success rate was 1 or 2%. So maybe 30 or 40 is better, but it's still not where we would like it to be. What we now know through the research is that a tremendous amount of the lack of success of those students is bound up in exactly what Melinda just said. It's bound up in the in non-cognitive skills, in what sometimes is called learning mindsets, ideas of growth and fixed mindset, belonging and inclusion, purpose and value are extraordinarily important, especially with the student population. So understanding how it is that at scale we can engage faculty members in going through the professional development about how to use those kinds of pedagogy techniques in the classroom on a day-to-day basis in the way in which they present material. I believe that that's the new frontier for not only in co-requisite instruction, but across higher education in general. In Louisiana, so we've actually been part of the Strong Start to Finish project, and part of the work that we've been doing with Strong Start to Finish has been exactly to do that, to take literally hundreds of co-requisite faculty and take them through professional development training about how to employ those ideas of teaching math and English through the lens of growth mindset, through the lens of purpose and value, through the lens of enabling students to really feel like they are part of the academic community that they have enrolled in. And that's just going to be tremendously powerful. We have a number of faculty champions across our state that we call mindset motivators, who are going to be working with their faculty colleagues to try to champion these ideas. But again, it is not by chance that we're using these strategies, that it has been more than a decade worth of research gathering information to understand what do we actually know about the experiences of students who have yet has been unsuccessful in the co-requisite strategy, and what are ways in which we can modify that structural change by going into the classroom and enabling faculty to approach the teaching in a different way. And I think that's just a really important insight to say, yes, what we have is more successful, but it is not the end. There is still further that we can go.
Brandon, did you want to weigh in on dual enrollment?
Yeah, just I would like to, because that's what I did prior to coming to Complete College America. I ran a concurrent enrollment program for close to a decade. I'll say something briefly, but if people are interested, please reach out afterwards so I can go in more depth. I think co-requisite is a great place or a great thing for dual enrollment. with a really big caveat when done correctly. So when I was doing concurrent enrollment, I saw a lot of really bad practice of putting students in college remediation to supplant the high school curriculum, or when they'd actually already gone well beyond that through their high school curriculum, but because it maybe met checkoff boxes for the district, they would put students in. And so we need to be really cautious of doing a deep dive of the curriculum, of the assessments, of the actual material, the content of where does the high school curriculum end, meaning where, when a student does it, should they be prepared to take a college course without the need for remediation? And that's the key point, because what we did in concurrent enrollment for the authentic experience is if we did something at the college, we did it for concurrent enrollment students. So if students should be prepared, remember, an asset-based approach, they have the requisite information going in. So you're not taking someone who's never seen the material before. They go directly into the college course. But if we find through placement that they still need support, then they do it through a co-rec model, but it has to be a true co-rec model. So I think there's a lot of ways to do it well, but with the caution of doing it well. But I think it has great potential.
Terrific. So one of the things we haven't talked very much about actually is placement reform, and that is kind of third pillar of the DevEd reform. Fortunately, our audience has asked about placement and exams. So the questions from the audience are, what are the panel's recommendations regarding improving college entrance exams and maybe even high school end of course exams to provide better guidance on college course enrollment? And separately, there's a question about the effectiveness of guided self-placement. So please weigh in.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in and just say my recommendation is to get rid of the exams. There isn't evidence that they're effective, and there is evidence that high school GPA is very effective. And we should be using high school GPA. It's effective, been shown to be effective for at least 10 years out. That should be the first primary way of placing students, is based on high school GPA. Now, there are some students that don't have a high school GPA. And now I'm going to turn it over to Melinda.
Thanks, Amy. But I will say I'm going to try to do this in much less than our remaining 8 minutes. But this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. We are actually finishing up a national study looking exactly at this, at new placement approaches within the DevEd framework. The first 2 papers should be coming out Thursday or Friday. So I will make sure that they are included in any follow-up email to all of you. They're just going through the final design and copy edit phase. But we really did try and look at, what are folks doing rather than use placement testing, because we know that it is not good. Like, it does not capture all of those multidimensional things we just talked about. We have decades of evidence that GPA is better, although I'll say I'd love to see all of that updated post-pandemic. I want to be, the researcher in me wants to triple check that work. But we're seeing a lot of institutions around the country experiment with alternate approaches. Everything from more robust assessments that include things like self-assessments, metacognitive assessments. Do you like math? Do you not like math? Do you have access to a computer? All the way up to guided self-placement or no placement. And we will unpack all of that in the reports. There was a question on guided self-placement, so I do want to address that specifically. The data are promising. I will say a couple of caveats. One, the guided part of guided self-placement is critical. If you're going to move towards guided self-placement, don't let that be like self-placement with a guided in front of it. There has to be true institutional structures to help students make good choices, and the onus remains on an institution to build in those structures. So that's caveat number 1. Caveat number 2 is we do have some evidence that women and students of color tend to underplace themselves. Now, there is an alternate version of that where that's because they feel like they want help. And there's a part of me that's like, cool, if they want help, let them have it. But I think you need to be aware of that tendency in a guided self-placement model. And finally, we don't actually, to my knowledge, certainly in my evidence base, we don't actually know what students think about that approach. We believe that by giving them guidance and agency, that is a good thing. I have not yet spoken to students to find out if they agree. And it is possible that some students find that self-placement off-putting, and actually like all that information overwhelms them. We don't know. So I want to throw that out there as a hypothesis, and anyone who funds more studies we would like to do that study. But I do think, you know, we know tests don't work. We know that they're not accurate. We know that they create harm for many students, and guided self-placement is really promising because it lets students kind of drive the bus, and our students are adults, so they should have some say.
So we just have a few minutes left, and I want to actually take moderator's prerogative here and ask a closing question to each of the panelists. And that question is, what's your top recommendation for what you would like to see happen in DevEd reform over the next 5 years? And in particular, what recommendations do you have for policy, particularly at the federal level? We have a new administration coming in, and what would you tell them? So Tristan, if we could start with you.
Yeah, I would actually love to see an audacious target. Like I just think about the Lumina Foundation back in 2015 when they sort of set this guiding light to say, you know, by 20, you can pick your date. I think theirs was 2025. There's plenty of states that picked up 2030. But regardless, sometime in the future that 60% of the adult population would have some credential. They match that to evidence from Georgetown, and that sort of audacious target in so many ways was a rallying cry for just higher education in general to now be very introspective in saying, okay, so what are we for? How do we think about how it is that we might do that? And what does that target mean? I'd love to see something similar when it comes to developmental education. Simply say, okay, look, over the next 5 years, we want to increase the number of students who pass math and English by 1 million students or something like that, so that we can really, just as an endeavor for higher education, to rally behind this. And it may well be that, you know, it may well be that co-requisite is not the optimal approach. But I think what we absolutely know is the traditional remediation is absolutely not the optimal approach. So if you can do better than co-requisite, knock yourself out. But anybody who is hanging on to traditional remediation and say, no, actually, that boat has so sailed. So let's put us behind us. And now, so I'll make the charge. Let's see if we can together across higher education get 1 million students through co-requisite or through freshman math and English over the next 5 years, 1 million more than we have up until now.
Who's next?
I'll jump in and just do +1 10 times for times 10 for Tristan. Yeah, we've surfaced here today some of the things that are still unknown, but that should not be a barrier to acting on what we do know. We could make so much improvements within 2 years. We could do it in 2 years. Tristan's done it. And we could do that nationally. And that should be the goal. I do want to mention something, one equity concern I did not mention earlier that I would like to see research on is in math pathways, there is a concern that the distribution across the pathways, like where students end up in those pathways, is not equitable. And that maybe that students are getting advised possibly into pathways based on their demographics and not their goals, or maybe they don't know what their options are. And I think this is something we need to understand. And again, it's not a reason not to do math pathways, but it's a reason to learn how to do it even better. And going back to Melinda's point about continuous improvement, we've got to continue to find the things that aren't working and figure out how to make them work. But don't let that stop our progress on the things we know work.
Okay, Melinda.
I'll go next on the policy, if we have time, so that Brandon can end, because it feels like CCA should be the last voice on this to me. I'm going to say number one actually is money, which I know we're not supposed to say, but let's be honest, doing this work well actually costs things. And I'm just too old to pretend that like we can do the same old thing for less money. The other piece of it from a policy perspective, and I want to +1 Tristan's ambitious goal, but add to it, I think that we need a policy framework that nurtures innovation. What we're seeing in a lot of states is that the policy frameworks are great at getting people to do what we already know, and thank goodness for that. They're less effective right now at figuring out what we do with, for example, those 30% of students for whom co-rec doesn't work. And so a policy framework that gets the laggards to do the bare minimum, but also rewards the innovators would be super helpful, and then put dollars on it so people aren't doing it on the cheap.
I know we're at time, so I'll be quick. I see the lever at the state level rather than federal level for state policy. And that really clearly eliminates traditional prerequisite remediation, skills co-requisite support. And I like the caveat, this will make Melinda happy, that if you have something that works as well or better with throughput, that be allowed to happen. But that we, and that policy that includes support for faculty to lead the effort. So that's funding, but it's also professional development so that we can get rid of practice that harms students.
Wonderful. Well, we are at time. So I want to say a huge thank you to the audience, huge thank you to our panelists, and huge thank you to my co-host, Michael Escoas. I really appreciate all of you being here today. And please feel free to reach out anytime. Take care.
Thank you.